All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me, Chris, and for the introduction. So I'm going to talk today about the effect of misophonia on cognitive and social judgments. It's a paper that Chris posted the link to on the registration website, but I'm going to break it down a little bit for you today. So to introduce this, let me introduce you to this guy. We will call him Tom. If I asked you how likable you found Tom, you'd be like, I don't know, Heather, I don't know anything about Tom. So if I told you instead that Tom was a bank robber, you might be like, oh, no, he is less likable. And if I told you that Tom donated to charity, you might think he was more likable. This is a well-established finding in psychology, that if you know something positive about someone, you find them more likable, and negative, less likable. But what happens if the thing I tell you about Tom is a little bit less positive or negative, obviously? What if I told you that Tom chewed gum? Well, the answer to that question, whether you find him more or less likable, might depend on whether or not you have misophonia. Now, I'm using these terms in my paper, the effect of cognitive and social judgments, but maybe if you're not like me, maybe you don't use these terms in your everyday lingo. So I'm going to start off and just kind of break down what I mean by these things so we're all on the same page. So to start off with cognitive judgments, what I mean by that is more or less how we kind of perceive our physical world, more objective judgments. So let me give you some examples. If I asked you out of these set of buildings, which building was tallest, you'd be making a cognitive judgment because there's an answer, the red building, right? If I asked you what color this shirt was or what size the shirt was, you could judge that for me. If I asked you a multiplication question or to memorize a word or things like that, you could judge the answer to that question. If I asked you whether a banana is a fruit, that would be a cognitive judgment. And then lastly, if I asked you if you've seen this person before, you'd be making a cognitive memory judgment. The answer is yes, you have. Now, in contrast, social judgments are more of how we make sense socially of our social world. These are typically more subjective. So for instance, if I asked you how trustworthy you found someone, there's not really a right or wrong answer. We might all have a different opinion. Or how attractive you found someone, how maybe dangerous or threatening they were, how friendly you found them, or how likable in this case you found them. These are all kind of social judgments we make about various people or our surroundings. Now, how does misophonia fit into this? And this is kind of a question that I had. Now, we don't know a ton, but there have been a couple studies that have explored the cognitive impacts of misophonia and how that affects our cognitive judgments. And to just share one of them with you, there was a group who had participants study a written paragraph for a later memory test. Think of this like you're sitting in a college course and you need to be able to, regurgitate the textbook for an exam or something. But unbeknownst to the participants, one of the people in their study group was actually part of the research team, and they secretly chewed gum the whole time. So they were wondering how well people with misophonia would do on that memory test later when there was gum chewing compared to when there wasn't. And they found in their results, if they looked at their comprehension scores on that memory test later, that folks who didn't have misophonia controls didn't perform any differently when there was gum chewing present compared to when there was not, when there was just silence. But people with misophonia performed significantly worse on that memory test when there was gum chewing compared to when there wasn't, kind of indicating that there might be a memory effect of misophonia. Socially, though, there hasn't been as much study, but I can tell you anecdotally from my own work some kind of interesting social anecdotes. So for instance, in a paper of mine from a couple years ago, I presented participants a variety of different sounds, and I asked them to identify the sound for me in a text box. And they wrote me some fantastic answers, just a couple of which I will share with you. So someone wrote that there was a chewing pig person in describing a sound, and another wrote that there was a crunching cave person with no manners, indicating to me that people are judging each other socially when they're making a trigger sound. So I wanted to investigate this a little bit more experimentally. Is it more than just anecdotal? Is there an actual effect here? So my main research questions of this paper and of what I'm going to talk about today are simple. Does the presence of trigger sounds impact someone's cognitive judgments, those more kind of objective academic kind of judgments? And does it impact social judgments, how they feel about someone? And let's kind of go through the methods of this. I put a little warning on the slide to let you know that throughout these methods and results, I will be listing the words of various triggers. So if you're someone who gets bothered by the word itself, maybe look away kind of during these parts. I will not be playing them though, so you're okay. But just to demonstrate for you, in this experiment, I played sounds for my participants, and those sounds came from multiple source categories. So you have your classic oral trigger sounds, the ones we hear in literature a lot, things like breathing or chewing gum, for instance. But if you are familiar with my work or if you've attended these other science sessions, you know I'm a huge proponent that misophonia is more than just oral trigger sounds. So I also have a category of non-oral trigger sounds, things like typing, for instance, or maybe chopping food, those types of things. Now, to control for that, I also have other sounds that are not typically bothersome to folks, things like maybe ambient sounds of a coffee shop or a harp that might be more pleasant. And then lastly, just to control for any sort of auditory stimulation at all, I have quiet as a category as well. Now, these sounds came from the FOAMS database. So this is a free open access misophonia stimuli that I put together with some colleagues that's now published that you can find at the Journal of Open Psychology Data. And the cool thing about this database is that for each of the sounds that you see listed here, there are multiple examples of each of these sounds. And I have just a visual depiction of breathing, for instance, for you. And you can see visually just how distinct each of these examples are, which helps to kind of demonstrate that there's so much variation in these sounds in the real world. And by showing multiple examples of each of them, I'm kind of trying to be a little bit more ecologically valid, a little bit more realistic to what we experience in the real world. Now, I'd be remiss not to just stop detour real quick and point out that this FOAMS database was only possible from soQuiet. So as Chris alluded to earlier, I was awarded a soQuiet Misophonia Research Grant along with my colleague Danielle. You can find that information from another soQuiet science session that's now on YouTube. But because of this funding and this support, we were able to produce FOAMS. So super cool, keep contributing to soQuiet. All right, back to results. So this task that I had participants do was a two-part task. So in this first phase, what I had them do was learn a bunch of faces. So I presented each person 96 total faces, one at a time, and they had a couple different tasks. Their first task that they had is what you see on the screen here. So they had to make a quick gender judgment about whether this face most presented as female or male. And I took these results from a normed database. So there was a large sample from this face database where participants rated for them whether or not that face was male or female. So all of these faces, I have kind of a normed answer to them. After participants rated whether this face was male or female, they were hearing a sound play in the background. So participants knew when they saw this face that they should imagine that person making the sound that they heard. They should associate those two things together. I'm going to play for you an example, and I'm going to demonstrate for you. I think you're going to hear a coffee shop sound. So not triggering, but just in case I did audio correctly, that's what you should hear. Let me give you kind of a front seat into what participants did with this. So here's the task. After they selected male or female, I asked them to tell me what sound they heard. And if the audio went through correctly, you likewise would have heard a coffee shop sound. These are all the different sounds that I showed for you on the previous slide, so they had those as options. After choosing what sound they heard, they gave me a confidence rating, how confident they were that that was the sound they heard. Most people are pretty high confident here. And then I asked them to tell me how much anxiety or discomfort, kind of my misophonia rating for how bothersome that sound was. So for each of those 96 trials, they saw a face, They gave me a gender judgment. They told me what sound they heard, and they gave me an anxiety rating. So a lot going on here, right? This was in phase 1. So in phase 2, they were surprised with a memory test. They didn't know that this was going to come. In this memory test, they were shown the same exact faces they had just seen before, as well as an equal amount of new ones that they had never seen. And again, they were asked multiple questions. So the first question they have is this social judgment that you see on the screen here. I asked them how likable they found the person in this image on a scale from 1, not at all likable, to 7, extremely likable. And again, I'll put you in that driver's seat and let you experience this. After they rated how likable they found the person, I asked them whether that face was old or new, had they seen it before? And regardless, what sound was playing in the first phase when they first saw that face? So if that face was old, if they remembered that face, what sound was playing when they first saw it? If that face was brand new to them, they were told to select this face is new. Obviously, there wasn't a face playing with it, or a sound playing with it. Again, they were given a confidence rating. Most people are pretty low at this. This is pretty hard when you don't know you're supposed to be memorizing these sounds and faces. Okay, so a lot going on here. But let's look at the different things that I can study with this paradigm. This is a paradigm I did in a sample of participants. 26 of those had misophonia. They're the ones that you see here in the red box. I've got a kind of complicated graph on the screen here, but let me break it down. I think it's kind of interesting, especially to us folks who have or studying misophonia. I gave my participants a couple different common misophonia assessment scales in the literature right now. You might be familiar with some of them. I'm also not sure. I should have hid this. Can I hide this? Yeah, I should have done it at the very beginning. I'm so sorry. But now you can see my axis label, which is that I use the S5. That is from colleagues at Oxford. That gives misophonia kind of on a scale of 0 to 250, as well as the Duke Vanderbilt Misophonia Survey Questionnaire that you see here on the y-axis, because I know that there's kind of some variability in how people respond to certain assessment scales. And I'll draw your attention to this little key right here, because I find this really fascinating. On the right here, I have what that Duke Vanderbilt scale diagnoses or kind of recommends as a diagnosis for each of these individuals based off their total score. And I've color coded based off their diagnosis. So if they fell in the clinical range, you'll see it as red. And if they fell with no misophonia, for instance, you'll see it in green. I also have altered the shape of the data point based off how they self-reported whether they had misophonia or not. If they came in the lab and they answered, yes, I have misophonia, you'll see it as a square. If they're like, I don't know, maybe, somewhat, you'll see it as a triangle. And if they said, I absolutely do not have misophonia, you'll see it as a circle. And if you look at this data with me, you'll notice that while there are definitely some patterns that emerge, you'll see most of my red squares up here at the top, and you'll see most of the green circles down below at the bottom left. There are some anomalies. So there's kind of some difficulties with how do you interpret someone who comes in and says, I absolutely do not have misophonia, but then they score high on a scale. Or vice versa, maybe they don't score high on a scale, but they say they have misophonia. It's a little bit complicated. I don't know the right answer to that question. So I subdivided some of my analyses into what I called extreme groups. So these are folks that are congruent in all three of those measures. They are my red squares. They, yes, self-report misophonia. They are clinical in the diagnosis, and they are higher than the cutoff score in the S5. And then true extreme controls, which are the opposite of all those criteria. So this kind of gives me a more pure measure, hopefully, of the binary category between misophonia and controls, acknowledging, again, it's more of a spectrum than it is a binary category. Okay, that was a lot of information. Let's get into some results. First question, does the presence of trigger sounds impact cognitive judgments? I can answer this question in a couple different ways from my data. The first thing I'm going to look at is that gender judgment, that judgment of whether that face most presents as male or as female. There's sort of a right answer to this question. So let's see how people did. I'm going to show you results both in their accuracy of this gender judgment that you see on the left, so whether or not they correctly selected male or female, and as well as how quickly they made that response on the right, their response time. And now we didn't really expect this to be a difficult task, but interestingly, when I graph how accurate they were at doing that gender judgment, depending on what sound was playing, I found that participants are actually significantly less accurate at identifying male or female when the sound that is playing is an oral sound. So let me say that again. If a sound like chewing or breathing is happening, participants are less accurate at identifying male or female to that face. That's across all participants, though. If I look just by group, it doesn't quite meet significance. So there isn't actually a significant difference between individuals with misophonia and controls here. It seems to be an effect that's across all people. If I look at response time, however, how quickly they were able to tell me that gender judgment, I see some significant findings again, where both oral in orange and non-oral in blue sounds had participants react slower to that gender judgment compared to control sounds. Now you'll notice here that quiet also has kind of a slow reaction time. And I think that might be kind of due to like an anticipatory response, like they're kind of waiting to hear if something's gonna happen. So I'm not gonna make too much of that, but what I find interesting is that those trigger sounds, oral and non-oral, do kind of slow participants down. But is there an effect by group? And in this case, I do see one. So you'll notice that both oral and non-oral sounds show that individuals with misophonia in red are slower at responding to that gender judgment than controls are. But it's not just a general slowing. It's not just that people with misophonia in general respond slower, because you'll notice the control sounds didn't have a difference. So they're just as quick as controls are at answering when the control sound is happening, but not when oral or non-oral trigger sounds are happening. Now, in addition to gender judgment, though, there's another way that I can look at this, and that is with memory. So this is an old or new memory judgment in phase 2 of whether or not they saw that face before. If I look at their performance across all categories, again, I see that when there was an oral sound paired with that face, participants remembered that face worse or less. They didn't say that that face was old as often, compared to when it was a control sound or no sound paired with the face. But as before, I didn't really see a difference between groups here. So I was like, okay, maybe there is a better way of splitting apart these sounds. Like maybe my external categorization of oral and non-oral, maybe that's not the best way of doing things. So I did this analysis again, and as some kind of people are referencing in the chat, maybe some of those control sounds might be triggering for you, or maybe sounds in the oral and non-oral category aren't triggering for you. So I said, all right, I'm gonna let the data tell me, I'm gonna let participants tell me what they find the most bothersome. So I took those 12 different sounds that I had, and I took each participant's discomfort rating and I rearranged them for each person. And I said, all right, for each person, I'm going to call the topmost sounds their high discomfort sounds, and I'm going to call their bottom sounds the low discomfort sounds. And that way I kind of get a true measure for each person, what sounds are, quote, triggering and which ones aren't. So I did this analysis again, and I said, all right, based off how much discomfort they felt for that sound, what was their memory for the face? And I find that again, there is a significant decrease in memory. People are worse at remembering faces when that sound is a sound that is highly discomforting to them compared to when the sound is not discomforting. And this again was shown in both misophonics and controls. So kind of an interesting finding, but one that doesn't quite differentiate people with misophonia per se. So as just a preliminary kind of summary to my first question, does that presence of trigger sound impact cognitive judgments? It seems to be there, yes, there is an impact, but maybe not specific to misophonia. It seems overall that these oral or non-oral sounds lead to kind of decreased performance while the sound is happening, slower reaction times, less accurate, that kind of thing. And also worse memory for the person later, but maybe not, again, specific to misophonia. So looking at then our second question, does the presence of trigger sounds impact social judgments? And to answer this question, I'm going to look at that likability rating that you saw in phase 2. And again, I didn't really see any significant difference based off of the external categorization of oral, non-oral, etc. No differences between the groups either. And if I split it apart by how aversive each individual found the specific stimuli, I do find that individuals are less likable when the sound that is playing is one that is more aversive to them. But again, not a significant difference between groups. So I sat here and I was like, oh man, maybe this is not actually, maybe this is just an anecdotal finding. Maybe people with misophonia express like, oh, this is like a pig person or someone without manners, but maybe it's not something that in scientific experiments actually comes out as a effect. But then I sat here and I thought, and I had a reviewer on this manuscript actually suggest this analysis to me. And it relies on the fact that if I asked you how likable you found Tom here, if you forgot anything that you learned about Tom, if you had no idea what Tom does, you wouldn't know how to rate his likability. You wouldn't have any information to go off of. If you forgot, for instance, that he was a bank robber or that he donated to charity or that he chewed gum. So maybe I should look at this instead based off whether or not they correctly reported what sound that person was associated with. So I did this analysis again, but I incorporated their sound memory on that last slide. So whether or not they correctly identified the sound that was played with that person versus if they incorrectly, if they chose something else. And I'm going to split apart for you. On the left side in the red box, you'll see the results from people with misophonia. And on the right, the gray box are controls. And I'm going to show you how likable they found the person. First, when they did not correctly tell me the sound. So you'll see across the board, no matter what the sound was, if they got it wrong, they rated that face as average likability. They had nothing to go off of. They didn't know where they'd met that person before. That sort of makes sense. But interestingly, if they correctly reported for me what sound was playing when they met that person, for controls, again, no difference. It didn't matter to them whether they remembered or not, but it did for people with misophonia. So two interesting things here. When it was an oral sound that was playing and they correctly remembered that it was an oral sound that was playing, they found that person significantly less likable than if they forgot that it was an oral sound that was playing. And this is the reverse for control or positive sounds. So if they correctly remembered that that person played the harp, they found them more likable than if they forgot. And this is a finding specific to individuals with misophonia because, again, controls didn't show a difference. Now, I wanted to look at each sound individually in case there was a pattern here. And again, you'll notice it's average when people didn't remember the sound. When they got it incorrect, everyone gives it about a 4 of likability. But when people with misophonia correctly identified the sound, there's some variation. And I'll note these aren't significant differences between groups when I correct for multiple comparisons, because I have a lot of different tests going on here. But visually, there's some kind of intriguing findings. So for instance, you'll notice things like clearing a throat shows that people who correctly identified clearing a throat did in fact rate that person as way less likable than if they forgot that it was a clearing a throat. And you'll notice harp, again, shows the reverse effect. If you remembered it was a harp, you found that person more likable than if they forgot it was a harp. Kind of interesting things going on here. I did this one more time, though, with those self-reported discomfort readings. So aversive and non-aversive sounds. Again, average likability if you forgot what the sound was. But intriguingly, only for the misophonia group, if you correctly reported that the sound that you heard with that face was one that you didn't like. So for instance, if you reported, I don't like typing sounds, and that was a face associated with the typing sound, and you correctly said typing is your answer, you found that person significantly less likable than if you forgot that typing was associated with that face. And that's not a general result across everyone because controls didn't show a difference depending on correctness in their sound memory and aversion of the sound. Okay, that's kind of a lot of complicated nuance, but overall, what I'm showing in this study is that yes, it does seem that trigger sounds impact social judgments, and in fact show that someone is less likable when you remember the trigger sound being paired with them. So a couple key takeaways for you here. One is that people who are associated with trigger sounds and remembered to be associated with trigger sounds are less likable to individuals with misophonia. So if you remembered that Tom chews gum, you are going to find Tom less likable if you have misophonia, at least according to this study. The second takeaway here is that trigger sounds seem to decrease cognitive performance, things like memory for a situation or speed at doing a gender judgment, but not specific to misophonia, at least in the variables I collected in this study. But lastly, I want to say that more work is definitely needed here. There's a lot of interesting nuance in this study and a lot of key things that I want to explore further. And specifically here is how much individual variability or how different people were in responding to these questions. So for instance, the misophonia assessment graph I showed you at the beginning had some variation in how people responded to each assessment, kind of indicating that maybe we need to give people multiple assessments if we're going to assess misophonia, or maybe we need to kind of refine exactly what subset of misophonia we're looking at, or what symptom we care about, or that type of thing. There's kind of maybe some more attention we need to focus on assessments. But also, there's individual variability in what sounds people find triggering. So having just a category of, quote, oral trigger sounds might not have been the most effective way of studying this. And instead of something like aversive versus not aversive, having data tell me which sounds are most bothersome for each person is a little bit more effective because everyone's different in what's bothering to them. And that's when something like foams, for instance, is a little bit more useful because you could then have a little bit more freedom to choose which specific instances of the sound are more bothersome to the person you're specifically studying. And lastly, memory performance showed huge individual variability. So for instance, if I had someone with misophonia, sometimes they did better at remembering when a face was paired with a trigger sound. Maybe they've learned to kind of cope with that. Maybe they hunker down and really focus when a triggering sound is happening, and they really pay attention to that person and they remember them more. But I had other folks with misophonia who completely were distracted. For instance, maybe they forgot that face altogether. They had worse memory for a triggering face. And I don't really know what causes that difference. None of the different measures that I collected were, whether it was age or different, gender or ethnicity or other symptom scales, none of that seemed to explain to me why some individuals did better and some individuals did worse. So that's something that I seek to explore in the future. All of that, I just want to acknowledge the two labs that helped me complete this work at The Ohio State University. And I'm going to stop screen sharing. I'll take whatever questions y'all have.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Hansen. That was awesome. Actually, it answered some of the questions I had after reading the paper.
Good.
So I'll ask a few questions, but if anybody has any questions, feel free to throw them in chat. That was pretty fascinating. I do like to remind everybody, I'm not a medical researcher, so I'm coming at this from a true layperson's perspective. I went to grad school for theater. I just have had misophonia my whole life. So a couple things. Is it safe to say that the gender task was kind of a red herring? As just
absolutely.
Okay.
So, yeah, we actually in the research domain, we call that an incidental encoding task, which is a fancy way of saying, I want you to look at this face, but I don't want to tell you to memorize the face. So by giving them something like, what is the gender? I am forcing you to assess the person without specifically being like, all right, memorize their hair, So yeah, I didn't really care. That task was just there to get them to look at the face. And then when I found results with it later, I was like, okay, this is not what I was expecting.
Yeah, I've found after participating in psychology research and so forth, I've always found there's something in there that's a bait and switch.
There's
like
always.
They're asking you to do something just to get you to participate.
Yeah.
A couple of quick questions. I thought it was interesting, first of all, that you used the Duke Vanderbilt assessment method and the S5. They're both pretty current, even though the Duke Vanderbilt was developed over a little bit. I haven't seen that one really used in research, and I'm glad that you're using that because a lot of studies use pretty older, like 10 or more years, the Amsterdam Misophonia Questionnaire, the MQ, and those are a little outdated. But I'm kind of curious why you picked specifically the Duke Vanderbilt one. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I just hadn't seen that one used before.
Great question. Also, I echo your statements there. I am also guilty of using some older ones. So I was really, since this is one of my most recent experiments I did for my dissertation, I was like, all right, this is my chance to use the ones that are recently published. So I chose the Duke Vanderbilt one specifically because it had suggested clinical diagnoses, which was something that I was particularly interested in to help me kind of gauge categories like clinical, subclinical, et cetera, wondering if there was an effect based off your severity of misophonia. And again, I just want to acknowledge that I'm learning in my studies that misophonia is better studied as a continuum, as opposed to like a binary, you have it or you don't. But for the sake of research statistical testing, it's a lot easier if you just have like two groups to study as opposed to a continuous measure. So I chose the Duke Vanderbilt scale because it was new at the time. It seemed to have a lot of good validation behind it. It had been shown to be used in populations like autism, which I found kind of intriguing. And it had suggested, it was also shorter. So it was like, I think 18, 21, so some amount of questions that was not going to be too burdensome to my participants to take. And it offered potential diagnosis suggestions. So those are all my reasons for choosing it.
Awesome. Very cool. We have a question from Mary. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and read the whole thing just so you can get the context. But what a terrific study. I have an observation that I'm hoping you can discuss. It's surprising to see how quickly misophonia research began to say that triggers are primary orofacial, which I know you have refuted in most of your work. There were just one or two studies showing this link. And I think suddenly the language in the literature shifts to say that triggers are orofacial. This ignores so much, as you know. So personally, I think orofacial people open the door to pathology more easily, thus is more amenable to psychology. The same is true for visual triggers, which I want to ask you about as well. Why do you think visual triggers are ignored in the research? Most people with misophonia appear to have visual triggers, and for some, visuals are worse. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. That's also part of a question I had, which is your study doesn't include visual context, which is a challenge as well. So I'm hoping you can speak on Mary's questions and that.
Yeah, very good question. So just as a behind the scenes, I tried the study with visual input first. I tried the study with visual images of like someone chewing gum or someone, whatever. And I can tell you after multiple pilots, I wasn't seeing any differences in performance with misophonics and controls. And I think to tell you why, my best guess is because of how misophonia has been defined for so long, as you have mentioned in this comment. If your idea of misophonia is being bothered by oral sounds, and you join a social media group online, a support group, and it's all based off of not liking oral sounds because that's what you've heard the definition to be, you're self-selecting a group of people that are all just aversive to oral sounds. So if you test them and you give them oral sounds, you're likely to find that they show a difference, that they hate oral sounds. But if you give them visual triggers, you might not see a difference because they're self-selected for oral sounds, not for visual triggers. So I kind of feel like we might have shot ourselves in the foot at the start of defining this as an oral aversion. And I don't genuinely know why this started this way. But I think because that's perpetuated in media, I think it gets picked up by a lot of media blog posts because it's really fun to be like, oh man, I hate this person smacking gum. That's relatable to everyone. I don't know why it's that case, but I think it's self-selecting our samples to only then people who are bothered by those sounds, and therefore we're only seeing results when we use those sounds, which means the only studies we see published are the ones that show results. And it's just like a cycle. So I think what I would advocate more is that we study more folks from the general population, folks that are not just in support groups because they know they have misophonia due to oral aversion, and show things like visual stimuli that might be bothersome and kind of expand that work. So that is something I would like to do better in my research moving forward. I don't know if that tackle all the different things.
I think so. Yeah, you were talking about visual context as well.
Yeah, so different. Well, that's something that I have ideas for moving forward, a better setting visual context and visual triggers. It is, yeah, not something I did in this particular study, but it is one that I think if I could figure out how to do well, I want to do.
Gotcha. Yeah, that is the challenge. Like Dr. Davydenko and Samermit's work on pairing sounds with alternating visuals and how triggering they are. So it gets more and more complicated. Mary and Andrea have a couple of questions, but I had a question sort of related to what you were talking about. You were talking about social judgments, and I don't know, something that comes up is that obviously misophonia and our misophonic reactions are involuntary, but it's a little tough to shake sometimes the fact that there is judgment involved. And a lot of times misophonia activating sounds are bad manners or something, or they don't fit within a particular situational context. Since you've done brain scan studies, how does like our judgmental part of our brain, our prefrontal cortex and so forth, inform misophonia as far as what we know? We think of it as auditory processing, or but there's judgment totally unconsciously a lot of times happening, and this study mentions that as well.
Wonderful question. And I'll answer just speculatively, because obviously the study didn't look at neuroimaging here, so I can't definitively say. But I think that you're hitting the nail on the head, Chris, that like what we're seeing in the brain is not just like auditory cortex differences. It's not just like hearing the sound itself that is causing me to be bothered. It's how that region is connected to things like frontal cortex, or areas that control how like disgusting or emotional I find something, or how much I can focus my attention on it or not, or whether things are morally acceptable or not, those types of things. It's how that region of the brain is connected to the frontal cortex that seems to be most important. So it would be really neat to do a study like this in the scanner to see if I am seeing more activation, for instance, of these kind of frontal, judgmental, social kind of regions in people with misophonia compared to controls. That is a good future direction that I'd be excited to approach.
That would be fascinating. Yeah. Mary's next question, then we'll move to Andrea's, is about sort of the anecdotes about aggression and misophonia. You mentioned this a little bit, I think, with the Vanderbilt assessment, that there was an issue that you found with that. But the S5 has a category for outbursts that seems problematic to me because of how the category seems to double down on aggression. What's your take on that?
I struggle so much, and I'm going to just disclaimer, I'm not a psychometric study. I don't make scales. I don't validate them. I will leave that to the experts that do that. But I will tell you that these types of variables did throw me for a loop when I was looking at results. Because similar to like the Duke Vanderbilt I mentioned, the study has like a specific criterion for like needs to show like external anger or like outbursts and things. And not everyone does. Everyone experiences misophonia slightly differently. So I think that it might be something where instead of using like a total score of how people are overall averaging on all these different subscales of outbursts or internal or impact or whatever, maybe it's going to be more effective to look at specific domains. Maybe we want to look at just how you externalize or just how you internalize. Those are other S5 kind of categories. I didn't subdivide. Something that might be interesting to look at is like how participants performed based off that outburst metric. I know when I looked at memory performance, I was describing how there's just large individual variability in how people, whether they remembered better or worse. And I did in that case try to correlate results with the different subscales of like the S5 and the Duke and like whatever that I had. And I didn't have anything clearly describe the results. But I think using those individual subscales for other analyses might be something that is effective or it'd be interesting to look at. So yeah, I agree that these categories might be problematic or might not be. I think they're just getting refined. I think we're in that process of research where like we're trying things and seeing how it works. And I hope that in the upcoming years we'll land on like a scale or a group that works. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know. This is purely speculative. I wouldn't be surprised if having thoughts, like sort of coping by having thoughts like that, not acting them out, but, it's pretty common for us to hear, I just want to grab that pen out of their hand and set it down, or doing something aggressive, but not acting out on it. Maybe helps people cope. Yeah. I'm not sure. From Andrea, I wonder if an individual's misophonia knowledge affects their social judgments, i.e. more knowledge, less judgment, less knowledge, more judgment. Yeah, so I guess it's our knowledge of what misophonia is refines our reaction to it, or maybe more than that?
Yeah, interesting question. That's something that I know some other folks have looked at in their studies as far as like how familiar people are with the term. And I think that might kind of be reflected in, like, I asked people to self-report whether they had it. And I think folks who didn't know what misophonia was were less likely to tell me that they had it. But I think this question, I'm not sure if this is quite what you're getting at, but it reminds me of actually my previous study when I had participants type for me what the sound was that they heard. Their knowledge of that sound definitely affected whether or not they found that sound aversive or not. So if I had people tell me that the sound of chewing was just someone walking through mud, for instance, they described that sound as being less aversive and they weren't as bothered by it. It's sort of similar to like the give it and go Sam Ramit kind of work, that if your knowledge of that sound differs, your reaction to it differs. But I haven't studied it specifically with social judgments. So that would be an interesting kind of follow-up to see whether or not having more knowledge of misophonia, knowing that it exists, or maybe knowing what the sound is versus maybe making it a more ambiguous sound, I don't know, might make it make someone feel different socially.
Cool. So you've got three future
studies. I have so many future studies.
Future studies. Another one that I would be interested in along those same lines is, once you know what a sound is and the context is, does your judgment change? Mm-hmm. Here's one example that I have told before is my wife and I were at the Aldi grocery store. I heard a very clear, I'm going to have to say the sound, like gum popping. Hopefully people don't mind me saying that. And so, I was like, I got to go see who's doing this in the store. I'm so frustrated. And when I go around the aisle, I see that it's not somebody doing that. It's actually somebody cutting a tension band off of some stock. They were stocking shelves, and it was just that sound. And once I knew that it wasn't what I thought it wasn't as triggering to me, which I thought was really bizarre. That's and I've heard other people report something like that as well. Like, brains are weird.
Brains are so weird.
Brains are very weird. Another question from Mary, and then I've got a question from one of your parts of the discussion. But how might we learn about misophonia and social judgments to be applied to interpersonal issues that arise because of misophonia? Great question. For example, I wonder how someone with misophonia who is profoundly triggered by someone's breathing can still look at that person with love and trust. That is the big question. Relationships. How does this affect relationships? It seems to me that the ongoing misophonic triggering reaction over time would threaten that. The social judgment part of the study seems to reinforce that. That is the big question. I agree. We talk a lot in our peer groups about like resentments towards loved ones and the challenges that faces. But how would you respond to Mary?
I agree. That's a big question. I think it's one of those things that maybe if you take a step back and you say like, okay, I know that this person does a sound that I don't like, and I can recognize that the resentment I feel is not because I'm a bad person. It's not because that they are a bad person. It's because that I have this thing that is changing my brain chemistry, or that is like literally having me think of them differently. It's like this condition that is doing it to me. It's not like anything about who I am or who that person is. But it's tough. I don't know how you manage that moving forward, as far as being like, this person I know is less likely to me because they make a sound I don't like. That might be something that I'll collaborate with some clinical therapists on, to be like, what are some ways of kind of reframing that, or now that we know that that is a thing that is occurring, how can we combat it? I think a lot of the research I do is mainly identifying problems, and then I pass it to my clinical colleagues to figure out what to do with it. No, but that's a great question. I don't know.
We don't know yet.
I don't know.
Well, maybe a potential avenue for treatment, and again, this is layperson talk, is not what the path we've been going down is. It's the judgments that come along with it, and some of that, who knows?
Yeah.
There's a question for Andrea, but before we get to that, I have a quick question. And I think this one about ADHD and autism is also fascinating. You mentioned something in sort of the conclusions about perhaps there are different subsets of misophonia. This is something that you didn't really parse out in the study, but I've heard this before, and I think it's compelling. Like right now, we're using misophonia as a big umbrella term for maybe a variety of things. Audiologists think it's a type of hyperacusis. Over here, we're saying no, and a lot of people have a misophonia that they can directly relate to trauma. A lot of people do not. Is there trauma induced? this is stuff we don't know. So how would you respond? What's next for figuring out if there are different types of misophonia?
Great question. I think you're hitting a lot of good categorization. And I think the couple comments earlier about like some people with misophonia experience outbursts, some people don't. Some people experience internalization, some people externalize, that kind of thing. And recognizing that not everyone with misophonia has the symptoms in the same way. And what I was meaning in the paper, kind of describing that too, is like some people might perform better. Some people might cope differently with that misophonia kind of difficulty, where they hyper remember. They like emotionally attached to things, and they're like, all right, now I'm going to be really good at remembering the situation because there was a triggering sound, and the details are seared into my brain of this like situation. Whereas some people are like so focused maybe on the sound that they are distracted and miss everything. And I don't know why people react differently. And so I think that there could very well be sub kind of domains of misophonia depending on the level of impact to your kind of cognitive performance or your how severely it affects your judgments of others, or things like outbursts or the other kind of scale metrics. So definitely still some more work to be done. It'd be interesting to kind of factor out those different divisions and see if we can like actually create domains, but I don't know, that's future work.
Yeah, that would be fascinating. I'm wondering how you could do that. It kind of reminds me of the talk that Dr. Ward gave at the CARE event, which actually is a good segue into the next question from Andrea. I think the study would also have been enriched if some participants had ADHD or autism. A lot of times it's speculated that misophonic people are on the spectrum. Sure, it's often described as a neurodivergence, which I even use that term, and comparing their ability to concentrate. And my understanding is that the real challenge is to include or not include these. So what Dr. Ward talked about was it's actually difficult to find people who just have misophonia. So that we're only assessing people with just misophonia, and it doesn't overlap symptomatically and can be more easily explained by autism or ADHD or OCD or something else. So what's the challenge of that? Is a huge challenge.
It's so hard. This is something that I directly struggle with and identify with. I wish that I had given sort of assessment scales for ADHD and autism in my earlier work. I will like kind of tease that the current research I'm going to start is actually going to be in a population of folks with autism to study how misophonia is impacting those folks. So I hope to tackle that question a little bit more directly soon. Stay tuned. But yeah, it's kind of difficult because, for instance, like with neuroimaging, a lot of people will intentionally exclude if you've got other diagnoses for things like maybe you're taking medication for that diagnosis. And we don't know whether that medication is doing anything differently with the brain that we're not aware of. And we don't want our effects to be due to that medication and not like the actual condition. So one of my kind of things I want to improve on with prior literature of misophonia is including folks like this that have any diagnoses, and we'll just like document them and account for them in our analyses as opposed to excluding them. Because I think we are missing out on a lot of interesting nuance to misophonia by intentionally trying to sample just pure misophonic individuals. So yes, I think the study would definitely have been enriched if I had had a wider variation, if I had given scales of ADHD and autism. But that's something that hopefully moving forward we'll do better at.
Absolutely. And that's probably also a good chance to use the Vanderbilt scale. Dr. Zachary Williams, who helped create the Vanderbilt Duke misophonia assessment, is really big in autism research, advocacy, and so forth. So there's some crossover there that we're seeing. A few things to wrap up. I did want to ask, how do you think that your study will inform the misophonia population going forward? I know that this could help us lend credence to asking for accommodations at school and work and working with families who don't understand it. But some of your research showed that the concentration was affecting people even who don't have misophonia. So maybe this is a general no food and gum in class or at work for anybody. It would be helpful. What are
honestly,
your takeaways?
Absolutely. I think accommodations that folks with misophonia are asking for are going to help everyone. I don't think they're individual kind of accommodation. So I think something like no gum in the classroom would be great for everyone's focus and concentration. I think things like this might help schools realize that it's not just like a specific, this weird sample of misophonic people are having issues, but maybe it's like everyone is having deficits if they listen to gum chewing. But that said, I still think that it would be interesting to do more specific kind of school related studies of academic performance, like the study you posted in the chat about studying a paragraph for a test or things like that. I think more research would be needed to do things like, if I intentionally ask you to memorize this, or if you know that there's going to be something where you're prompted to have to perform, like, will your performance be different? And maybe then I would see things like memory differences between misophonics and controls. I don't know. I guess my babbling is just to say that I think that this study is a cool starting point to be like, all right, accommodations in general would be helpful. But more work as far as like what the particular nuance of how misophonia is affecting folks, more work I think still is needed.
Absolutely. I think the first time you were on one of these science sessions, you mentioned that the field of misophonia is an infinite wellspring of study ideas, and it seems like every peer support group there's a whole new. We need a master list of study ideas. We'll close with Brian's question. Thank you so much, everyone, for such wonderful questions. These are great. My daughter and I have discussed our reactions to. So it sounds like family, a very common thing, parent-child, both having it. Find that we're more irritated when the sound is something that we judge surely they must realize that's annoying. Like it's a social judgment. Sounds you use in the research, or some of those, whistling is a big one as well. Yeah, I've noticed that obviously the foams could be expanded more.
Absolutely.
With some other common triggers. But what's your take on just the social judgment aspect of it in families and what Brian is addressing here?
It's a good question, but it's something that, like, I identify with you. I say that, like, you know, when folks are chewing very open-mouthed, I'm like, they should know that that's bad, right? That's not me, that's you. But I'm realizing that that's not something that is a universal feeling amongst people, that like, just because I think that it's annoying or like you shouldn't be doing doesn't mean that, like, my partner doesn't have misophonia, for instance, and he'll see someone chewing and be like, no, like, they're allowed to chew like that. That's fine. There's no issue with it. So it's an interesting factor. It'd be something that I could ask in a future follow-up to be like, all right, how if someone is making this sound, not how bothersome do you find it, but like how socially acceptable is it? Like, can that person, like, do you think I could ask a likability judgment there? Do you think that person's less likable because they're making that sound in general?
Yeah. And one of the big questions has been, there's been a little bit of data on this, is in cultures where eating sounds are not only socially acceptable, but encouraged, is misophonia more rare? And the early data point, as Dr. Rosenthal has said, like in Japan, where, you know, eating sounds is considered something that's beneficial and, you know, is culturally very encouraged, that misophonia is actually about as prevalent there.
Yeah.
So it may not be as cultural and social as we think. We don't know yet. That's the real struggle. We have a lot of conflicting information. Any final thoughts? You've mentioned a few things of what's next, but after this study is done, what are some of your takeaway thoughts on it before we wrap up?
I think that this study just gives me more to look at. I don't think we have solved anything. I don't think the door is shut anywhere. So I am excited to keep exploring some of these cognitive and social differences, to tease apart, you know, why some people think one way and some people think another. I am in a transitionary kind of phase in my career right now, so I'm hoping to eventually start up a lab and be able to systematically tackle each of these questions myself, because there's a lot, like you said, it's a rich, infinite field of things that we can keep looking at.
Absolutely. Definitely. Well, Dr. Hansen, thank you so much for your time. It's always fascinating to hear about your latest research. I think this is your 4th or 5th paper on misophonia, and I'm sure there's many more in the future. So thank you so much. Thank you, everybody in the audience, for wonderful questions. We'll post the recording of this on our website and YouTube channel in the near future. But everybody have a great weekend. I really appreciate your insights, Dr. Hansen. Have a great rest of your day, everybody. Take care.